Alright guys, you made it. Chapter 41, final chapter in the textbook. Chapter 41 is on response to terrorism. Again, this in and of itself is more of a primer or a basic awareness of some of the things that we have to consider for terrorism. There are many more courses out there that will help you advance your knowledge in the cases of terrorism, and a lot of it really has to be a localized approach to it based off of what you have in your communities. So that's why there's not a good one-size-fits-all for terrorism. You obviously have a number of objectives on pages 1063 and 1064 in your text. Core concepts that we'll cover, some different types of terrorisms and terrorist events, how to identify the type of threat posed by a terrorist event, the use of time, distance, and shielding for protection at a terrorist event, how to respond to and deal with the harms from a terrorist event, and applying strategy and tactics at a terrorist event, as well as self-protection at said event. So obviously we got a huge number of topics here. Start with defining terrorism. So terrorism is the unlawful use of force or violence against a person or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. Obviously this is a scene from September 11th in New York. Here's that description. So domestic terrorism are groups or individuals whose terrorist activities are directed at a government or population without foreign direction. So a good example of this was the Oklahoma City bombing that happened, wow, it's been quite some time ago now, 15, nearing 20 years ago. But so the Oklahoma City bombing was United States citizens bombing places in the United States, and so it wasn't really geared towards another nation, it was geared towards our own. There's environmental terrorists who are threatening to do things to disrupt our environment. Survivalists, and militias, racial hate groups, extreme and political religious groups. A lot of times these people are looking for ways to coerce the government to do things their way. So there have been other things that have happened besides the Oklahoma City bombing, but that was probably the most common. International terrorism is groups or individuals whose terrorist activities are foreign-based and or directed by countries or groups outside the targeted country, or whose activities cross national borders. And there's a growing trend towards loosely organized international networks, for example, Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda has, a semi-structure to it. Doesn't have specifically hard and fast rules and hard and fast officers of their organization. They have some kind of unofficials, but for the most part they're kind of beaming and teaming together for the common, what they consider good. So terrorist events or incidents that we may run into. Weapons of mass destruction, which we classify weapons of mass destruction typically in the CBRNE categories. And the CBRNE categories are chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosives. And typically they're through a criminal activity is the way that they are unleashed or exposed to the public. So another example of I believe this actually is the Pentagon on September 11th. Another example of terrorism. This, of course, was an international terrorism event. So first responders as targets. And when we say first responders, the book says emergency medical responders, but in reality, first responders, which is the old term that we used for emergency medical responders, however, in reality, first responder means anybody who's some of the first people into a scene. So the term first responder these days refers to fire, EMS, and law enforcement as first responders. So they may be the principal targets of attacks. So they may have set things up, and I believe I heard something from the most recent Boston Marathon bomb, that they had designed some additional booby traps to target those people who go rushing into the scene. Safety of EMS providers continues to be our most important consideration. Dead and injured EMTs do nobody any good. So why are they targeting first responders? Well, it's a bigger reaction when you take out those who are there to help. So those that are running into whatever everybody else is running out of, you take them out, and because it is a small group of people, you do more harm. You create a bigger scare tactic. So to try to identify some of these threats, identify an incident that has potential to be an act of terrorism, it's also a crime scene. So at the very minimum, being cautious of that we're not destroying any evidence. And then looking at the auto signs to help protect against secondary attack. Looking at the occupancy of the location, the type of event, the timing of the event, and any on-scene warning signs. So when we discuss those sort of things, we're looking at these suspicious incidents. So something like the Boston Marathon. Of course, that's going to be a huge place in order to have a lot of people, and it's going to be high exposure. So certainly has the potential to draw some terrorists or some criminals. Oftentimes they'll also include certain other symbolic places, historical targets, public buildings such as maybe the courthouse in Oklahoma City, which was what was bombed, or as a federal building, but had federal courthouse in there. Maybe something that's fairly controversial, maybe an infrastructure thing. Imagine somebody blowing up the power plant or blowing up a waterworks. Would have a lasting effect on that community until temporary measures could be made. The type of the event. So is there explosions? Is there incendiaries? Firearms, non-traumatic mass casualty incidents, maybe where people become ill from poisoning or whatnot. Timing of the event. Does it coincide with some specific other historical event? Like they mentioned in the book, April 19th will be a day around which the government facilities operate on a heightened state because it's the anniversary of both the fire at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, and the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. So there's suggestion, and I believe it was one of the things that came out through the court proceedings, that it was in some way, shape, or form a retaliation for what happened in Waco. It was the Oklahoma City bombing. September 11th, that may or may not have been coincidental, that they chose the date that represented the number for emergency in the United States. And are there other on-scene warning signs? So you're looking around, you're paying attention to, is there patterns that can be explained, or odd patterns, unexplained signs and symptoms of the skin, eyes, and airway irritation that maybe doesn't match up with what we've originally been sent for. Odd containers. Yeah. So to recognize some of the harms posed by that threat, they have another acronym for us to use, the TRACEM-P, thermal, which could be either extreme heat or extreme cold, being a significant source that could potentially cause harm. Radiological, so alpha, beta, gamma rays produced by nuclear events. In most cases, alpha particles are relatively safe. Even if you go back and look at page 1096 in your text, alpha particles, for the most part, are blocked by a piece of paper. Beta particles by skin, and then requires lead lining in order for gamma rays. So things like X-rays, of course, require more than some of our other lighter radiation sources. An asphyxiant. Have they pumped something in to take the place of oxygen? Cyanide gas, for example, carbon monoxide. Those sorts of things can replace or substitute for oxygen, and therefore cause people to lose their life rather quickly. Chemical, toxic or corrosive type substances such as acids or extreme alkalins. Etiological, or caused by a disease. Anthrax, maybe, for example. Expose everybody to some anthrax or some botulism toxin. Those sorts of things can obviously make a lot of people sick very quickly, depending on the method in which we employed them or deployed them. Mechanical, physical trauma, such as bombs or shootings. A lot of times when they're making bombs, they're making sure to put extra shrapnel in there. The more shrapnel, the more stuff that flies around, when a bomb goes off, the greater chance you knock out more people. And then, of course, there's the psychological aspect of it, which you are involved in any of these other types. You're going to have a psychological aspect as well. Anybody who's been the victim of a significant crime has had to deal with a certain amount of psychological harm, which you were really worried. You started to wonder about the safety of yourself and your family. And so, psychological is big. It's huge. So, think about it. All right, so time, distance, and shielding. Minimize your time in the dangerous area that you're exposed to any of these potential incidents. So getting in, getting out. The less time we're there, the less chance there is for secondary, tertiary, quaternary events to happen. So maybe things are on a time delay. So if there's a significant time delay, they're expecting, EMS will get there within 20 minutes, and then maybe a second bomb goes off. And in those cases, if you're talking a specific time that they're expecting, minimizing your time there can potentially get you out of there and away from the potential second blast or second wave. Distance, maximize your distance from the projected hazard area, and then remember to consult the Emergency Response Guidebook. That's the orange book that we talked about in the hazmat section that you also probably looked at when you did some your hazmat training, either online or in person. Using that can help you if you have an idea potentially of what has happened or what is being involved. You can use that as a good resource to kind of give you a cushion of safety. Shielding. Use appropriate shielding, so behind vehicles such as the engine block. So you need to put the engine block between you and whatever the other incident is. Don't think that just sitting inside your vehicle you're safe. There are people every day that get shot through their vehicle door and are hurt. So your vehicle door, your windshield, that's not shielding. Something thick, something heavy. Get behind a wall, get behind and when I say a wall, I mean a wall that's made of actual structure, not a thin drywall wall. I mean, it's better than nothing because you can't be seen, but it doesn't have a lot of protection. Additionally, think of other things such as fire protective clothes, hazmat suits. Do you need to wear a positive pressure device such as an SCBA? course, your standard PPE. If you're dealing with a biological, such as maybe anthrax, or ricin. Ricin is a solid. So if you've got a shield, like gloves, between you and that substance, hopefully you're going to protect yourself from it. And then vaccinations, of course, but vaccinations against your specific diseases. So sometimes we'll hear talk that they want to start to vaccinate all of the providers against, in more cases than not, it's public health warnings, so that there's a big rise in whooping cough or something like that. But occasionally you also hear about something pop up as a potential protection against terrorism. So in our response to terrorism, chemical incidents, there's tons and tons and tons of hazardous materials that we can potentially run into. We know the 4 routes of entry for poisons into our body. These can be industrial chemicals, they can be warfare type agents. Sometimes they're just even very, very small amounts of certain substances have detrimental effects. Thermal, as a secondary to a chemical incident, it creates a heat reaction, asphyxiation, depletes your oxygen. Chemical, as a primary, causes some major systemic effects. Mechanical can start to break down skin and structures, and of course the psychological again. So respiratory protection, protective clothing, whether it's hazmat suits or bunker gear, and be aware of the possible contamination from your patients. So when we're dealing with chemical incidents, we have to be prepared to take things a little slower, because people are going to have to be decontaminated. Unless you are trained to enter these areas, you stay out of them. It requires additional training. It requires additional equipment, not stuff that we standardly would have on an ambulance. We take care of patients. We don't decontaminate patients unless we wear other hats and serve in other roles. If we're dealing with biologicals, this is it's focused on public health emergency. So public emergencies or public health emergencies are a focused emergency. The actual point or potential point of the origin is located, and attempts are made to prevent or minimize the damage or spread. Whereas with a public health emergency, there's a sudden demand upon the infrastructure with no apparent explanation. So all of a sudden, everybody's getting sick. Say somebody was able to contaminate a water system, would create a public health emergency. Can be a variety of different things: bacteria, viruses, toxins. There's all kinds of other potential biologicals, different unicellular organisms that could be a problem. Same sort of 4 routes of entry into the body. So exposure and contamination, these are kind of some important terms. Exposure, this is a substance taken into the body through a route of exposure, and contamination is a substance clinging to the surface of the body or clothing. So you can be contaminated and not exposed. However, normally if you get contaminated, exposure follows it up rather quickly. So it talks about some of the harms that go along with the biological incidents themselves. Again, these are repetitive of what we've seen in prior slides. So protective measures for biologicals. Try to gather whatever information you can get. PPE and respiratory protection, depending on the type of organism or substance that you're being exposed to. For PPE, minimum of gloves and usually a face protection and eye protection, but occasionally we need to take it up further and go with something called a PAPR or even SCBAs. So prioritize your protective measures. Remember, it's yourself. Use your buddy system in case something happens to somebody. And then the availability of a RIT team Fire departments have been working on developing RIT teams, and the RIT teams are specially trained to go in, get somebody, and get them out of there. And then, of course, civilian protection is important as well. If we're talking radiological or nuclear incidents, small nuclear devices such as suitcase bombs can be stockpiled in foreign nations. Radiologic dispersion is more practical and difficult to detect, as radiation symptoms often are delayed for hours or days. So, and if it's found early, it's treatable. So to talk about a large-scale nuclear exposure, that becomes well known quickly, and people start to take actions against it. But if we have this long, slow exposure, people may start getting sick, not even realize it, and it takes weeks potentially to even start to put two and two together that, wow, all these people are getting sick, and they all kind of have the same thing, because it's been so gradual the way that it's affected people. So again, self-protecting measures, time, distance, and shielding, very, very, very big here. Radiological detective equipment, such as what they commonly call Geiger counters, can help determine if we're dealing with a nuclear or a radiation event. And then there are certain decontamination procedures. Being around the Omaha metro area, many services participate in a number of drills on a regular basis to back up should something happen, say, to Fort Calhoun. So in those cases, you would get some exposure to decontaminating folks. So you would learn how to decontaminate at that time. You may have explosive incidents. There's a large variety of explosive devices, pipe bombs, whatnot. They can involve attacks on fixed targets or groups of people, and the explosive incident can include other types of exposures, so such as chemical or radiological. So self-protective measures, you need to be pre-blast and post-blast protection. Pre-blast operations occurring after written or verbal warning, so this is often when people get armored up. And then post-blast, the operations occurring after at least one detonation, which doesn't necessarily mean there won't be second detonations. All right, so dissemination and weaponization. So the dissemination of these CBRNE materials, again, we continue to discuss many of the common routes of poisoning, and one of the most common, most effective is that of the respiratory route. So by using the respiratory route, it's into the body quickly, easily, and it's not quite as easy to keep yourself out of it if it's just floating around in the air. Ingestion, of course, is a potential possibility. People who have to eat, and people who are unaware could easily ingest something that's toxic, as well as the dermal route. It's absorbed through the skin. Not quite as easy of a route in, yet is fairly effective when it's done correctly. There are certain areas of the body that are obviously much more absorbent than others, such as your eyes. Most of your mucous membranes could be passed from human to human contact as well. And in those cases, if we have somebody who's quote-unquote a weaponized person, I guess, certainly would could create havoc as they run through a crowded building. So most is effective when targeted through the inhalation route. We talked about that before. And with a particles being 3 to 5 microns in size. And this is so minuscule. It's not something that you're even going to be able to see. So the respiratory system is a perfect way to approach this. Airborne dissemination can be something such as applying energy to a certain material and it starts to give off fumes, vapors, and whatnot. There can be sprayers and aerosolization that put this stuff into the air. I mean, I suppose you could try to start thinking about all the odd terrorist bomber superhero movies out there, and you can imagine many of those cases in which somebody with the time and resources rigged the fire sprinkler system to spread it. I mean, somebody got into the heating and cooling systems of the place, the building, or what have you. So there's all potential kinds of ways to get that in there. Chemical agents, these can be gas, solid, or liquid. Vapor pressures and densities can vary across the spectrum, as we know that there are lots of different types of environments and different types of solutions or chemicals that can be introduced to them. Some that will lie very low, say down in the valleys and the nooks and crannies. Some that will rise up and above. The ones that tend to be more effective are those that sit low and hang lower than air, because that's where the people are. If they rise up quickly and they get up into the upper atmosphere, they're not nearly going to have the time to be as effective. So we're going to talk about some of the properties such as volatility, which is low boiling points and high vapor pressures. Evaporates very easily, comes into the environment. It allows the agent to have greater airborne release potential. So, you know, in chemical engineering, they can look at a lot of these things and say, how can we make this so it evaporates into the environment that quick? We could have things such as choking agents, which are primarily respiratory, vesiccating agents, which cause blisters, basically through more or less a chemical burn. Cyanides prevent oxygen use within the cells. If it doesn't asphyxiate you at the lung level, sometimes once it's exposed into the blood, and it makes it so the blood can't do its job, and the cells can't get out of it what they need. Nerve agents, which will go in and block some of the neurotransmitters in between our nerves and our muscles. Nerves in other parts of our body will have things called neurotransmitters, and there's a synaptic gap. And that synaptic gap, think of it kind of as a spark plug, more or less, where a spark plug, there's a gap in the spark plug, and the spark has to jump from one metal terminal to another metal terminal. That's a lot like how our nerves are. So there has to be something in the middle that will allow that spark to jump across there, and that's a neurotransmitter. There can be nerve agents that can go in there and cause those to go haywire or stop working altogether. May have tear gas. So some nerve agents fall under something we refer to as a toxidrome, the sludge or the SLUDGEM toxidrome. This is fairly easy to remember, and something that it would be probably a good idea to commit to memory. You can see this on page 1078 in your textbook. Salivation, or saliva is spit. Lacrimation, you're crying. Urination, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Defecation, that's obviously fecal material. GI upset, so it makes your stomach very upset and makes you nauseous. Emesis means you then vomit as a result of your GI upset. And then meiosis which is probably the least easy to remember, meiosis is the abnormal contraction of the pupils. That's common with many of the nerve agents, certain poisons such as organophosphate poisonings. And we deal with organophosphate poisonings from time to time here in the Midwest because of the agriculture. And it's not a nerve agent. It just so happens that it's also the side effect of some of these sprays that they're using. Again, our role remains supportive. We're there to provide patient care. In most cases, we're not there to do decontamination. We're definitely not there to clean stuff up and dam it and box it up and ship it off. That's definitely not our role. So when we're talking about what are we doing here, we're patient care. It's EMS. So we're not firefighters. We may also wear that hat, but that's a separate thing. So radioactive and nuclear devices, we may be talking something huge like a military device. We could be talking something such as improvised, people getting a hold of some radiologic agent. Sometimes we have dirty bombs in which the bomb goes off and it also not only is spreading maybe shrapnel, but perhaps also something that's either biological or radioactive. Certainly we could see acts of sabotage. Effects of radiation will have effects on the inner parts of our body. It really starts to affect the inside with not as much noticeable from the outside. So you could be talking things such as your bone marrow starts to fail, you start have dropping levels of red blood cells or even white blood cells. Your internal organ systems stop functioning at capacity. Usually with larger exposures there is some burning that goes on, but it may not be immediately evident. We may have incendiary devices such as blast injury patterns, lung injuries where if something goes off, if you were holding your breath, the blast went off, that shock wave can go and cause you to actually blow a lung and have a pneumothorax. Can cause things such as bradycardia as well, hypotension or hypertension. Ear injuries, abdominal injuries, anything that contained gas can blow up as well. So, and then your brain, you shake your brain around in there. So some strategies and tactics. Isolation. This is controlling the scene, isolating the hazards, and attempting to conduct a controlled evacuation. It is very resource intensive and requires law enforcement personnel, requires some tracking, because if we don't pay much attention to it, we have people roaming around the community, the state, the United States, that have been exposed to something. So some tracking is also involved. We need to have perimeters under control so we can, throughout the incident, kind of have an idea of who's where, or do we have anybody in? Hopefully everybody's out. Notification, if you're involved with any sort of terrorist event, there are a number of agencies that need to be informed. Usually this includes Department of Homeland Security, local law enforcement, probably state law enforcement as well. And a lot of times they're going to take care of getting this notification going. We can request additional specialized agencies to come out. That's where FEMA has done a lot of things to create something called the National Strategic Stockpile, where we've got places throughout the United States that are storage or clearinghouses for materials and equipment that would be used in these sorts of events. Most county emergency managers are also very well aware of that. Identifying the agent, sometimes it's a crapshoot. Sometimes it's going to take a long time before you're able to even identify what potentially caused this. Sometimes there's the easier way by a pair of binoculars and the orange emergency response guidebook, but the identifying the agent might not be something we get to know before we're completely done on this scene, at least from the EMS perspective. Protecting critical assets. One big thing that I guess came up, we'll say at September 11th, we had all these resources rushing down to the World Trade Center, and these World Trade Center towers came down and destroyed tons and tons of resources. Another thing, I guess, to think about, not only from that perspective, but if you focus all your resources in one incident area and now a second incident comes in, so imagine an hour or two after the World Trade Center events that then another part of New York was attacked. And where are all those resources? They're completely downtown. So it's something else to kind of keep in mind is what are our assets, and do we put all of our eggs into one basket? I remember for a period of time following September 11th, we could not even leave our garage door to our ambulance garage open because there was concern that terrorists would come and take emergency vehicles, because emergency vehicles are less likely to be stopped in certain areas. They would come and get and steal emergency vehicles and attempt to use those as a way to convey more terroristic attacks. Decon, of course, remains huge. We have gross decon by EMS personnel. This is simply removing the surface contamination, usually by brushing off what we can and then rinsing. And the amount of surface contamination gets significantly reduced, although there may be other steps in the decon process. May include certain chemicals, may include certain medications. Decon is a complex set of events. So protecting yourself is really kind of the main point of this chapter. So scene size up, we start to look for victims displaying signs of some sort of a hazardous exposure. Look for unconscious victims. Do we see any victims displaying SLUDGEM signs, which are some of the most common ones that we can quickly see? Blistering, reddening of skin, discoloration, victims with difficulty breathing, lots of victims with mass trauma. Do we have mass casualties or fatalities with no trauma? All of a sudden, everybody got sick. Not very common for everybody to get sick. Do we have other responder casualties? Dead animals and vegetation, odors, smokes, vapors. Remember your OTTO: occupation, timing, type, and on-scene clues. Things to kind of jog your memory. Say, is there a good reason that I can think of offhand why something would happen right here, right now? Don't rush in. Wait until it's deemed safe. Remember, we are given very minimal protective equipment against chemicals and whatnot. That's usually what fire service is concerned with. So we take care of patients. Incident command. This is huge. The incident command system, the ICS 100s and 700s that you've learned, that incident command system is there for a reason. All too often we get maverick public safety providers that are just self-dispatching and self-responding to scenes and just running in and doing whatever they can. And the resources are being lost because they're not being focused in the areas that they need to be. So following incident command is huge, because the incident command should have a grasp of the broad picture, not just what they can see from where they're standing. Of course, PPE. Be aware that secondary, tertiary, quaternary devices can be lurking and waiting. And then search all your patients for explosive or weapons. If they've been exposed to a chemical and they have to be decontaminated, they're probably going to have to be made naked. So that makes that whole job a little bit easier. understand your TRACEM-P harms. Don't forget to give time, and distance, and shield yourself. Use your specific tactics for each CBRNE threat. Use your resources. This is not something that we all can commit all this to memory. So resources and doing things such as drills helps us to refine and define our roles in these various incidents. So in review, although there have been terrorist attacks throughout history, after 9/11, we're definitely a different place because of terrorism. This isn't even something we talked about prior to 9/11. I mean, it was a minor thought, but there were not chapters in textbooks about it. CBRNE helps recall the different types of agents and weapons, and the TRACEM-P helps recall the types of hazards of these agents. You've got to remember that you must protect yourself from terrorist attacks, as well as anything that could be secondary, designed to injure or kill rescuers. Responders are often targets. Safety must remain a high priority. Isolation and perimeter control, as well as notification, are extremely important in managing a terrorist incident. We don't need more people coming into the incident and becoming part of the problem. Some things for you to ask if you were to find yourself in one of these situations. How can I best protect myself from danger and hazards during a terrorist incident? And what is my role in the incident response plan for a terrorist incident? All right, you arrive at an office where multiple patients are complaining of the same symptoms. They state that their office received several threats due to its role in a controversial foreign relations incident. You and your partner recognize the similar symptoms and decide they may be linked. What is your best course of action next? Well, number one, if you didn't, the very next sentence, should you remove yourself from the scene at this point or remain with your patients? So your best course of action, of course, is get more help and consider whether you need to remove yourself from the scene to try to protect yourself, or if you're already exposed, and then carry on your triage system and establishing command. So again, much like it was in the last chapter, we don't get to do a lot of EMT role here until somebody else comes and takes over incident command. Somebody else comes and starts the triage process. If we're already exposed, we're probably going to end up getting decontaminated just like our patients are. So get gathering as much information that you can pass that along by to the incoming agents, can help them protect themselves and set up an appropriate mechanism to deal with the casualties.